أولا أطيب التحيات ونرحب بكم جميعا، والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله. ويعني صباح الخير، ظهر الخير حسب المواقع الموجودين فيها. نتشرف جميعنا بمشاركتكم في هذه الورشة. بداية يعني ربما بعض المشاركين هذا سيكون بيننا الاتصال لأول مرة. أنا أكرم عيسى درويش، المدير الإقليمي للمكتب الإقليمي للصندوق الدولي للرفق بالحيوان. أتكلم ونيابة عن العاملين في الصندوق الدولي للرفق بالحيوان وعن الخبراء المشاركين في هذه الورشة والذين سيتحدثون في هذه الورشة عن مواضيع هامة جدا تتعلق بحماية الأحياء الطبيعية، الحياة الطبيعية أو التنوع البيولوجي، ومن ثم العلاقة بين حماية هذه الكائنات الحية والتأثير على التخفيف من آثار السلبية لتبدلات المناخ. الصندوق الدولي للرفق بالحيوان ومنذ عدة سنوات، ومنذ الملاحظة الكبيرة التي لاحظها كل سكان الكرة الأرضية على تأثيرات التغيرات المناخية السلبية، فتم تركيز منظمتنا على المواضيع التي تهم التخلص من هذه الآثار السلبية، وذلك من خلال تأثير الكائنات الحية، طبعا بعد حمايتها ومنعها من الانقراض، وبالتالي الحفاظ على النظم البيئية التي توجد فيها الحياة البرية كلها، إن كان القسم الحيواني وإن كان القسم النباتي. الحفاظ على هذه النظم البيئية هي أهم المواضيع التي تخدم حماية مكونات الوجود البشري على سطح هذا الكوكب. منظمتنا والعديد من المنظمات يركزون ومنذ سنوات عديدة على هذه المواضيع، ومنها مثل هذا الويبينار الذي نقوم به بإيصال هذه الأفكار من خلال الخبراء، إيصال هذه الأفكار إلى الجهات المعنية في الدول العربية، يعني في المينا ريجن بشكل عام. طبعا هذا الويبينار يتم هنا الآن، ولكن الويبينار يكرر في الأقاليم الأخرى حتى يسعى الصندوق الدولي للرفق بالحيوان ومن خلال الخبراء إيصال هذه الأفكار الهامة إلى الجهات المعنية التي سيكون لها دور أساسي برسم السياسات الوطنية في مجال مكافحة التأثيرات السلبية للكلايمت تشينج، وبالتالي الطبيعة ستكون هي الحلول المعتمدة في مكافحة التأثيرات السلبية للتغير المناخي. هذا الويبينار يجب أن نشير إلى أنه يعتبر خطوة تمهيدية لإيصال هذه الأفكار قبل مؤتمر الأطراف لاتفاقية التنوع البيولوجي، والذي سيعقد في نهاية هذا الشهر، ومؤتمر الأطراف لاتفاقية تبدلات المناخ. فنسعى إلى إيصال هذه الأفكار خاصة إليكم جميعا، ومن يحضر منكم في مؤتمرات الأطراف تكون الأفكار معه جاهزة، ويمكن أن يوصل هذه الأفكار إلى زملائه الذين سيمثلون بلاده في مؤتمرات الأطراف المذكورة، إن كان مؤتمر أطراف التنوع البيولوجي أو تبدلات المناخ. أتمنى منكم إن شاء الله المشاركة الكاملة والاستفادة الكاملة، وأتمنى ممن سيحضر مؤتمرات الأطراف أن يسعى أن يحضر الأحداث اللي بتسمى سايد إيفنتس، الأحداث الجانبية، أو أي يعني اجتماع يخص هذا الأمر. فكان الصندوق الدولي للرفق بالحيوان سينظم بعد هذه السايد إيفنتس، يعني بعضها، وبالتعاون مع منظمات دولية أخرى. نتمنى ممن سيحضر مؤتمرات الأطراف أن يشارك في هذه الأحداث الجانبية، أو أن يدعو زملائه أو ممثلي بلاده للمشاركة في هذه الأحداث الجانبية. الشكر الجزيل على مشاركتكم، ونتمنى لكم كل التوفيق والخير. هناك نقطتين فنيتين أتمنى أن أشير لهما. أولا، بالنسبة لاختيار اللغة التي تودون السماع بها، هناك ترجمة ما بين اللغتين الإنجليزية والعربية. فيمكن عند البانر بالأسفل حتشوفوا أيقونة محطوط عليها الكرة الأرضية، فممكن الدخول وتختاروا اللغة المناسبة التي تودون سماعها. هذه نقطة أولى. النقطة الثانية، الأسئلة التي تخص أي محاضرة، تخطر أي سؤال يخطر على بالكم وتودون توجيهه، فسنترك أمر الأسئلة حتى آخر نصف ساعة تقريبا من هذا الويبينار. فأرجو منكم من يود أن يكتبه على خانة question and answers Q&A. هذا المكان ممكن تكتبوا الأسئلة التي تودون توجيهها مباشرة ويجاب عليها من قبلنا، أو ربما من يود أن يقدم سؤال شفهيا، فبآخر جزء من هذا الويبينار يمكن أن تقدموا هذه الأسئلة إن شاء الله. الآن أنقل الكرة إلى ملعب زميلي الدكتور نابغ غدال أسود ليتابع المحاضرات البرزنتيشنز اللي حتقدم من الخبراء. طبعا أنا معكم، لكن بحب أنقل الطابة في ختام الموضوع. الشكر لكم جزيلا منا دائما، ونتمنى التوفيق في هذا الويبينار. والمجموعة التي عملتها على الواتساب ستبقى للتواصل إن شاء الله في رسم السياسات ونقل المعلومات التي تتوفر لدينا، ونتبادل هذه المعلومات من قبلكم ومن قبلنا، ونتمنى لكم كل خير. وباسم الصندوق الدولي للرفق بالحيوان والخبراء نتمنى لكم كل خير. بسم الله، والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
Assalamu alaikum jami'an. I will speak in English and make the introduction. So if you want, just you can listen from the Arabic channel as normal, as Dr. Akram has instructed you. Just one comment to share here, that the chat function is not working. So if you have any question to raise, just put it as the question and answer bar, not in the chat. The chat is not working in this setting of the webinar, please. So we'll start this webinar now as an introduction about the importance, further what Akram has said, with from Simon Edison, our climate change advisor at IFO. So by all further ado, Simon, please, the floor is yours for introduction.
Thank you, Nabeg. Good afternoon and good morning to all participants. It's wonderful to see so much interest in the webinar from across the region. My name is Simon Addison. I am the Climate Change Advisor at IFO, where I have had the great pleasure over the past few years to collaborate with friends from the Global Rewilding Alliance who are joining us for this webinar. The webinar is very much grounded in recent scientific evidence that has been developed by Professor Oswald Schmitz, who is joining us from Yale University. And this evidence, I hope you will find compelling, as it is evidence that shows the importance of wild animal populations in multiple ecosystems around the world for supporting carbon cycles and carbon sequestration. And this is, for us at I4, and we believe globally, an important set of findings to help us redefine the manner in which we develop and implement climate mitigation policies through nature-based solutions. wild animals, as we see it now at I4, are not simply the victims of climate change, they are indeed the unsung heroes of climate action. And we are hoping that through this webinar, you will develop an understanding for how we can use and partner with wild animal populations across the Middle East and North Africa region to accelerate our actions collaboratively to address climate change, both by improving the rates and at which carbon sequestration can happen, but also importantly, by using wildlife conservation as a means to support climate resilience and adaptation, both within the habitats in which wild animal populations live, but also among the communities and the local economies in which protected areas and other conservation areas exist. We will first hear a few words from our colleague Mark Haller from the Global Rewilding Alliance before passing over to Professor Schmitz, who will take us through the science behind this issue, which is referred to as animating the carbon cycle. We will then hear some case studies of the evidence that shows how wild animals perform this vital function in the carbon cycle. And then also hear from Reem Al-Mayala from NUAT, who will talk to us about marine systems in the Middle East and how critical they are also for carbon sequestration. I'll then provide some recommendations from research that I4 has conducted on how to integrate wildlife conservation into the nationally determined contributions of countries across MENA region before we close the webinar and take your questions and answers. So thank you for your attending and for your consideration. And I will, with great pleasure, hand over to the next speaker.
Thank you very much, Simon. It's a pleasure to be collaborating with I4, with you and your colleagues in the MENA region on something this important. And what I would like to do before introducing Urs Schmitz, who will speak about the animating the carbon cycle approach and the model that's built around it, just to perhaps give a few words of context, which I hope will convey the sense of opportunity that exists now for this approach. My name is Mark Halley. I have the honor to chair the board of the Global Rewilding Alliance. And I'm delighted to see Reem Al-Mayala, who's also a member of the board on this. I think you all know the Global Rewilding Alliance. It pulls together organizations around the world devoted to rewilding, some very large, some very small. But our aim is to stimulate rewilding wherever it is appropriate and wherever it is possible, because we believe that this is a key to planetary stability in the future. Just a few words then about the context. I think we all know that our planet is seriously degraded. The Global Land Outlook concludes that up to 40% of land on the planet is degraded. And that's not even taking into account the degradation of marine ecosystems. But this is a problem of vast scale. So we're not talking about little patches here and there that are degraded. We're talking about patterns that cover whole countries and regions. We are, as I'm sure you all know, in the UN Decade of Ecosystem Restoration. So at the global multilateral level, it's been recognized that we need not simply to conserve what's left, but to get to work to restore those very large areas of land that have a potential not only for productivity, but for biodiversity as well, and that this is becoming an increasing priority. You also know, of course, that in December 22, the member states of the Convention on Biological Diversity adopted the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, which is a very ambitious plan of action. It does, of course, include a call to conserve, to protect remaining critical ecosystems and natural resources. but it goes much farther than that. It talks about the need to stop doing harm. In fact, if you look at the financial calculations required to implement the Global Biodiversity Framework, you'll see that the bulk of them actually could be derived from no longer spending money on things that undermine biodiversity and not simply putting more money into conservation priorities. So we're beginning to look rather differently at the challenge of biodiversity conservation. And of course, it calls also in a very clear way to restore ecosystems, to look at nature as the foundation for development and to ensure that that nature has health. Now, this is the Biodiversity Convention. We're all familiar also with the Climate Change Convention, the Paris Agreement, and the targets that it sets for both 2030 and 2050. One of the most interesting and I think promising things that we're seeing over the past few years is what I call the convergence of the climate and biodiversity agendas. So we have realized that the single greatest cause of climate change on this planet is the destruction of nature. It's land conversion, it's land degradation, it is degradation of marine resources. And so this is nature, if you like, is the principal cause of climate change. But if you flip that on its head, nature is also probably the most promising approach for large-scale prevention of catastrophic climate change. So that investment in nature, investment in restoration, investment in the sound management of ecosystems is probably the single most significant positive pathway forward to stabilizing the climate at something around 1.5 degrees. So we see climate as absolutely fundamental to biodiversity conservation, just like biodiversity is becoming clearly a key pathway forward for addressing the climate change challenge that we face on this planet. There is, quite rightly, I think, a large focus on lowering emissions. We must lower emissions if we're not to slip over the most dangerous thresholds. But we also know, and science tells us, that this is not enough. We will not reach our climate targets unless we are able to fix atmospheric carbon. We have to remove carbon from the atmosphere on a very large scale, and the science around that is very clear. Now, we believe, and this is the introduction to the Animating the Carbon Cycle approach, that we have in this approach a win-win solution. Oz will present the model and the science behind it, and you will hear some case studies of its use. But essentially, this is an approach that addresses some of the key climate priorities while at the same time restoring biodiversity, nature, and healthy ecosystems. So it's very much a win-win situation. And also, if you look forward at the mechanisms that are being called for or being put in place now for funding this essential action on both climate and biodiversity, you see that there is talk of extending carbon credit markets, of establishing markets for biodiversity credits as well. And in a sense, the ACC approach offers the possibility of generating funding through the trade in these credits, both for climate and for biodiversity. So it's also potentially a financial win-win. And then there is a great deal of creativity going on in what we call performance-based funding, which is countries that are rewarded through debt relief or through lowering of credit rates or whatever for achieving milestones in the restoration of nature or in achieving their carbon targets. So that there's a whole financial world sort of, in a sense, crystallizing behind these approaches. We believe at Global Rewilding Alliance that the ACC approach is a game changer. This is not yet another tool that's been developed that shows promise. It really does have the potential to change the way we think of the climate nature challenge together, a way in which we can argue politically for the restoration of nature and achieve financial income to countries that badly need it. My last word is that we believe that the Middle East and North Africa region is absolutely key in rising to this challenge. You have your fair share of degraded land, but you also have extraordinarily valuable ecosystems keystone species that need to be preserved, and a track record of bringing some of them back from the brink. So I think that what's happened in the MENA area has the potential to go to scale in a way that we would very much like to see happen. And if the Global Rewilding Alliance and its partners can be helpful in that, you can count on our support to you. So with that introduction, let me hand over to Oswald Schmitz to introduce the ACC approach and the science behind it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mark. And thank you all for joining. I would like to take some time this morning, as Mark said, to just explain the science behind animating the carbon cycle. What I'm going to talk about is how we can connect conservation of wildlife with arresting climate change. The big issue that we have to confront, though, is something that happened almost 250 years ago with the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, when we started burning fossil fuels to drive our economy and our economic development. And with that, over time, what we see is the emissions increased as the economy rose and started accelerating. And what we end up having is a lot of CO2 built up in the atmosphere. Now, the IPCC and globally, we realize that if we continue on this path, we are really going to have critical climate warming on the planet, catastrophic warming. And so what people are trying to do now is think of ways to stop the emissions. One of the ideas is that we reduce emissions by converting to green energy technologies, renewable energy technologies, with the goal of reaching net zero emissions by 2050. The problem is we still have, even if we reach net zero emissions, we still have about 500 gigatons of CO2 in the atmosphere. That's a legacy of our past economic growth. 500 gigatons CO2, or 500 billion tons of CO2 still in the atmosphere. And if we don't get rid of that, we will overshoot 2 degrees Celsius, right? Even if we reach net zero emissions, we're not going to prevent the climate from increasing beyond 2 degrees Celsius. So what we really need to do is come up with negative CO2 emissions, not just net zero emissions. What we mean by negative CO2 emissions is that we have to enhance the sink of carbon on the planet somehow, so that we can draw out the CO2 out of the atmosphere and store it on the planet. And many of you may have heard already all of these technological solutions that people have proposed. That is certainly one way to go about doing it. But we're arguing that we can also use nature, because nature already does the job. It's a proven technology, if you will. And so let's try and think about using nature to arrest climate change as well and enhance sinks. And if we do that, increase the sink strength, we have the potential to arrest climate warming somewhere between 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius. But we have to do it now. We have to think about enhancing nature's ability to store carbon, and then we can reduce the atmospheric CO2 on the planet. And this is what we call nature-based climate solutions, or natural climate solutions. And currently, what people have proposed are two kinds in terms of the nature-based climate solutions. There are two main strategies. The first is avoid emissions. In other words, if we're going to try and reach net zero, we can't just continue to destroy ecosystems and release more. That has to go hand in hand with reducing emissions. So we have to avoid emissions, and then we also have to enhance the sinks, right? We have to increase the capacity of the planet to take up more carbon. So we protect what we have and enhance. So those are two sort of components of ecosystem conservation that we need to do in order to reach net negative carbon emissions. Now, the challenge that we face is between now and 2100, we need to remove about 6 to 7 gigatons of CO2 a year to meet the goal of preventing the global temperature from rising above 2 degrees C. 6 to 7 gigatons, or 6 to 7 billion tons per year. And we're proposing that we can do that by enhancing the carbon dioxide sink strength of the planet through nature-based climate solutions. Now, let's look at the numbers, though. Part of the decarbonization, as I said, to reach net zero is protect against release. And that protects us 5 gigatons per year. That's really important. 5 gigatons per year is about what the United States emits every year. So, it's a huge amount. But enhancing the sink strength is really what we need to do if we want net negative emissions. And right now, all of the proposed solutions in nature combined only give us about 5 gigatons per year. And that involves, managing timberlands better, managing croplands better, managing agriculture better, but also restoring forests and restoring wetlands and other ecosystems that are heavily degraded. And if we do that, again, the best that we can get is 5 gigatons of carbon per year. But what about animal? And so there's a shortfall, right? We need to get an additional 1 to 2 gigatons per year out of the atmosphere. But what about animals? You look at this picture, all we see is livestock and plants. We don't see animals. And historically, it has been presumed that animals aren't going to be abundant enough to have an impact. And this comes from a very fundamental idea in ecosystem ecology, that if you look at the biomass of life on the planet, and you look at the amount of biomass as plants, the amount of biomass as herbivores, and the amount of biomass as carnivores, you see progressively less and less and less biomass, simply because of ecological inefficiencies, transfer efficiencies of energy up the food chain. You end up getting these pyramids of biomass or pyramids of numbers. And for this reason, people have assumed that animals are going to be very rare relative to plants and soil biota. And therefore, they have assumed that because they're comparatively rare, they're not going to have a big impact. But the thing is, that's not accounted for is the feedback effects that the animals can have on the ecosystem. And those feedback effects can be very large and disproportionately larger than what you would expect by animal abundance. And this happens because of their interactions in food webs within the ecosystem. And there are common mechanisms of ecosystem impact among animals, regardless of whether you're going from the Arctic tundra through drylands and grasslands, through savannas and forests, and then also into the deep marine. All animals, through their interaction in food webs, contribute to controlling the carbon cycle through their foraging, by depositing nutrients. They release nutrients in their body wastes. They disturb ecosystems. They can deposit organic carbon in their body material and also, again, as body waste. And in terrestrial environments, seed dispersal, especially for forests, is really important because that enhances forestry production. Now, if we took the information that's available currently, and these are data where people have actually measured the contribution of animals in the ecosystems relative to locations where the animals are absent. So you can do a comparison of what happens when the animals are there versus what happens when the animals are absent. And so the numbers I'm presenting here is the net effect of the animals above what happens when they are absent. And if you look at just these several species here, what you see is that these animals here already contribute to avoiding emissions of 5.8 gigatons per year, right? So they're contributing to avoiding emissions. So this number is not even accounted for because we're not thinking about animals. It's not even being accounted for in the current nature-based accounting. So what we may have is actually a doubling of what's going on right now in terms of protection. But what also may be happening is that because we haven't accounted for the significant impact of these animals, we may be underestimating the capacity of nature to protect against emissions if we lose these animals, right? So if we lost wildebeest, or if we lost wolves, or if we lost sea otters, then maybe we might not achieve these avoided emissions targets because we're losing an important driver of that. So that's something to keep in mind. But more importantly, we have other species that we could restore and rebuild their populations. And if we look at what they can contribute, we already get almost another gigaton of CO2 that can be taken up on the planet and stored in ecosystems. And that's 0.783 of the 1 to 2 gigaton shortfall. So they're already potentially able to make up the difference. And so these are huge numbers compared to what nature-based solutions are already looking at. And this is why we're very optimistic and inspired that maybe, you know, conserving animals, enhancing their restoration and protection can really make an important contribution toward more rapidly reducing CO2 out of the atmosphere and storing it on the planet. So what we really need is a change in mindset. Again, as Mark was pointing out, we often think of climate change as being something that causes damage to biodiversity. And we sort of think about animals as being stuck on a ship, you know, the climate ship, and they're just passengers that are headed on an ill-fated voyage. But what we're trying to argue is that the changing mindset sees animals as important drivers of the climate ship. And so through biodiversity conservation, we may be able to help fix the climate problem. I'm going to walk, you know, so to really sort of quantify this, and we need numbers, we need better numbers, because a lot of the science hasn't been done in terms of actually measuring things in the field. And so what we need to also do is sort of be able to calculate the potential of different animal species. And so what we've done is developed a new carbon cycle model that builds on the plant soil carbon cycle models that we already have in existence. Those models include photosynthetic uptake of CO2 from the atmosphere. It accounts for plant respiration. It accounts for plant recycling, and, you know, carbon and leaching in the soil, soil respiration. So we're really accounting for what current carbon cycle models account for, but we've added in the effect of animals into that. And that includes animal respiration of herbivores and predators. It also accounts for the recycling effects that these are the feedback effects that I mentioned earlier on. And it's those feedback effects, especially through nutrient cycling, that can actually fertilize the soil and boost the productivity of the plants, also disproportionately so, relative to the animal's abundance. And so once we start thinking about these components of the carbon cycle, we get a different sort of perspective on what's going on. And what we're trying to do here with this model is really sort of go globally and figure out what the potential is for a whole variety of different animal species to help contribute to reducing CO2 in the atmosphere and storing it on the planet. And so we're hoping to, you know, really develop a global map of high potential areas. And these are areas that we think are really high potential candidate areas and the kinds of species that might be suitable. You'll notice that we haven't really got much for North Africa and the Middle East. There's a lot more opportunity to help inform us what can be contributed in that region in terms of restoring wildlife species. And we can help out to try and figure out how much difference that will make. I'm going to finish off with a couple of case studies just to show you the potential. The first is actually a real world example of a conservation success. So what happened prior to 1960 is that there was a disease that spread from domestic cattle that were being grazed in the Serengeti to wildebeest. It was called rinderpest. And the rinderpest wiped out, almost wiped out the wildebeest from their historical numbers of about 1.2 million animals down to about 250 to 300,000 animals. And what happened was, because these animals didn't graze the landscape and the migration was shut down, much of the Serengeti was burned every year, because there was this uneaten grass that was this cured fuel that was able to burn and burn widely. And so what happened is that the Serengeti was a net source of CO2 to the atmosphere. And it just, lots of CO2 went into the atmosphere. Conservation eradicated rinderpest, so the rinderpest declined in these populations, and so quickly we see the wildebeest numbers rise. And what's really exciting is, in the matter of 20 years, we're not talking about 100 years, we're talking a very reasonably short time when you're thinking of a large animal that's long lived. In the course of about 20 years, their numbers rebuilt back to historical levels. Okay, they migrated again. You have a much greener landscape because they're eating the vegetation. When they eat the vegetation, they release carbon in their dung. The dung gets buried and protected in the soil. And so what you see as their population numbers rose, you also see a rise in how much carbon is taken up and stored on that plain, the Serengeti plain. And we end up getting here a net sink of carbon when these animal populations have been rebuilt. The amount of carbon that's stored each year in the Serengeti is enough to offset Kenya and Tanzania's CO2 emissions from fossil fuel burning. So these animals are actually protecting against emissions, or they're helping to avoid emissions that could really exacerbate the climate problem. But this is a nice success story because it shows it can happen very quickly, and that gives us much optimism. Again, what we've done also is applied the model to see what might happen in another region. So what we can do with this model is also, it has parameters, so we can go to the scientific literature and get data to parameterize the model for each of these components. And when you do that, and this is an example from a Mexican dry tropical forest, what we're looking at is restoring and protecting mountain lions, or puma, and jaguar, and their main prey, white-tailed deer and collared peccaries. And these two herbivores feed on shrubs, but the shrubs are understory in the forest, and these animals use both the shrub habitat and the forest habitat. So these are these food web relationships, these interdependencies, and the feedback effects that these animals cause, both in the forest and in the shrubs. And if you parameterize the model and then make predictions of what the animals would do when they're present relative to what things would look like in their absence, what you find is that with all of the animals intact, with the food web intact, we can take up 3.18 times more carbon into the ecosystem than if the animals are absent. Obviously, this is a modeling approach, so we have to validate it a little bit. Nobody has measured this, so we can't validate that against what the animals would do, but we can validate it against what happens when the animals are absent, because a lot of people have measured ecosystem processes when the animals are absent. And so our baseline here matches very closely with what you see in the field. So this actually gives us confidence that the model is making reasonable first approximations of the benefit of these animals to net negative emissions. Now, if you extrapolate this from the kilometer square basis to all of the dry tropical forests that are protected in Mexican parks right now, you increase the sink strength by 10.4 million tons of carbon per year. And that's the equivalent of 1/10 of Mexico's CO2 emissions a year. So, using Mexico's protected areas and restoring and protecting these important carnivores and herbivore species can really enhance the ability of the ecosystem to store this. Now, I want to underscore one thing. We shouldn't be using animating the carbon cycle to think of it as an offset approach, so that we can continue to release fossil fuels. These animals are just going to help ecosystems suck it up. we still need to reach net zero emissions. What animating the carbon cycle is trying to do is increase net negative emissions, increase the sink strength of ecosystems. The numbers we present here are just to give you a comparison of the magnitude of the effect. It can be big, it can be country level size. And so if we scale this, we can actually have a meaningful impact in terms of enhancing the sink strength of ecosystems. So with that, thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to discussions and answering questions.
Thank you, Professor Oswald, for this presentation and case study. It was very interesting and enlightening. And just to continue that one, we'll move on to the with the presentation to the another case study that will be presented by Dr. Reem. Reem is the president of NWAT from Bahrain, and we are honored to have you on this webinar. So please, Reem, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and it is an honor and to be here today. I'm very excited to be able to share some of the insights that my team and I, in addition to all of the members that are here today or put together this very informative webinar on animating the carbon cycle. And I think this is one of the most important, just a second, is my screen showing? Yeah, okay.
Yes, indeed, thank you.
Yes, yes.
Perfect, thank you. Yeah, so one of the things that I always think is very, very interesting whenever we talk about the MENA region in general is there's always, I think, this stereotype, not just when we think about it from an external sense, where people, when they think about the Middle East and North African region, it's all about everything's a desert and there's not much there. And then even internally, when I work with members of our community, especially like here in Bahrain or the Gulf, a lot of people are under the impression that there is not much that actually can contribute towards climate mitigation other than mangroves, for example. And I'm here today to really push the case that that is definitely not the reality. And the reality is that we are a very diverse, we've got a very diverse marine system, and the biodiversity that it holds actually is key towards what I like to think is the window as to what the world might look like in the future in light of climate change and climate impacts. Because our ecosystems are existing in very extreme conditions, and this is across the Middle East and North African region. First off, it is a very diverse ecosystem space, as mentioned previously, and we've got different ecosystems from mudflats and rocky shores and reed swamps and salt marshes, and this is we're talking about coastal ecosystems, mangroves, seagrass beds, coral reefs, and much, much more out there. And what is really interesting is that when we look at it, we think, okay, it's just a system. Now, one analogy that we, a lot of people from the community of, shall we say, the rewilding and restoration space is that if we think about ecosystems as the skeleton, then the animals and species that inhabit them are seen as the organs. And logically, there is no skeleton that can fully function and be very efficient without the organs being present in there. And so this is what we are trying to bring back. We are trying to bring back ecosystems that are fully functional with all of their members. And one of the things as well, I think already Professor Oswald has already explained how marine biodiversity plays a critical role in the carbon cycling, which is very essential for regulating the Earth's climate. But many people always maybe ask for examples on exactly how do marine biodiversity, how does it contribute to this process? And to break it down, although some of this was already touched upon, but I just thought it was very important for us to go into a bit of the detail so that we have a very clear understanding as to how that happens. We've already touched about primary production and how that links to carbon sequestration. And when we think about primary production, it's obvious we're talking about, for example, phytoplankton. So we've got photosynthesis. We all know that phytoplankton is available everywhere in the oceans, and that is why the misconception when people think that trees are the main, shall we say, game changer in terms of taking in carbon dioxide and producing oxygen. In reality, it's actually our oceans that's doing that. It's producing over 70% of the oxygen that we breathe as humans. And that is a combination between the phytoplankton, but also seagrass beds, mangroves, and other primary producers within these ecosystems. And spaces such as seagrass beds, mangroves, and salt marshes are usually referred to as the blue carbon habitats. And of course, you know, they sequester significant amounts of carbon in their biomass, but also their sediment. We look into things a bit further. We're looking at carbon transfer through food webs, and this is also something that the Professor Oswald mentioned previously. But marine organisms, whether we look at them from tiny zooplanktons to say the bigger predators, all of them, you know, going down the food web, consuming and transferring this carbon within their bodies, and it passes down. And then we look at the carbon burial that goes in the sediment, of course, when a lot of these marine organisms die off, and then things basically go down into the sediment of the ocean floor and stay in there for years. And that contributes to carbon sequestration especially we can see it in the geological timescales. And of course, we look at things like a decomposition and respiration, and that also is that balance that marine organisms play between carbon storage and the release within the carbon ecosystems. Now, the MENA region, as I mentioned previously, is a very marine biodiversity hotspot. And why do I say it's a marine biodiversity hotspot when a lot of people always think about biodiversity hotspots being areas such as, say, the Great Barrier Reef or the Indo-Pacific in general? The thing is, despite our extreme environment, there is a lot actually present in our region. So if we start with the Arabian Gulf, we've got the largest aggregation of dugongs in the world within the Gulf. And then we've got also the largest concentration of whale sharks in the world in the Gulf. In addition to that, we've got the largest breeding colony of the Socotra cormorant birds, also present in the Gulf, and the very unique Arabian humpback whales populations, which are very known to be genetically distinct, and they're not migratory, so they don't have long migratory routes, and they're around the Arabian Sea area. And then when we go into the Red Sea, they're also very diverse in terms of, as we said, as we know, coral reefs, but also different species of sharks. And we're talking about hammerhead sharks, blacktip sharks, sandbar sharks, you know, the shark population or elasmo population is absolutely diverse and huge in the Red Sea. And looking and moving into the Mediterranean, it's also similar in terms of biodiversity, where we've got things like basket sharks, and we've got, again, black tip sharks and sandbar sharks and other species. So all of this combination, I'm just giving very few examples, but if we dive in deep, the biodiversity that the waters and our water bodies hold is very, very rich. And obviously, with all of these species that are present, these species inhabit ecosystems and move through different ecosystems, thereby also helping in the cycling of carbon within these systems. And I just wanted to shed some light on some examples of how they might be. Now, when we talk about shorebirds or birds that are around the coast, a lot of people forget that they play a very big role in carbon cycling. So we've got species such as, say, the greater flamingo, we've got the plovers, for example, and they're very crucial. Why? Because they feed on the mudflats, which helps regulate the nutrient cycling, which can indirectly contribute to carbon sequestration. However, as we all know that due to habitat loss, and I believe Mark earlier also mentioned that land conversion is one of the principal causes of climate change. And it's just because we're losing a lot of the biodiversity due to habitat loss. And with that, we're losing these key species that help in the entire process. There was a paper published last year by Shamna et al. In 2023, and it was basically showing significant population declines in the Kentish plover birds in some areas around the Arabian Gulf, especially between the years 1980 to 2020. And of course, the decline is attributed towards habitat loss because of coastal development, but also climate change and increased human disturbances. If we move moving out of the Gulf, going into the Arabian Sea and the Gulf of Oman, what we have there is the Arabian humpback whales. I've mentioned previously that they're very endangered and they're very isolated, and currently it's estimated that there's less than 100 individuals left, and they're classified as endangered by the IUCN. So what these whales contribute towards is basically carbon cycling by transporting the nutrients between the deeper waters and the surface, enhancing like the phytoplankton growth. And unfortunately, they're very endangered, and there's a lot of threats that are facing them. And part of that threat is actually habitat degradation. Of course, we've got the fisheries bycatch and vessel strikes. Moving into the Red Sea, we're looking at shark populations, although I'm talking about the Red Sea shark populations, but this spreads across the entire region when it comes to sharks, especially the reef-associated sharks, which are facing significant declines due to overfishing, especially black-tip sharks and white-tip sharks. And recently, there were some figures that estimated that there's a decline between 60 to 73% on a global scale. Currently, the biggest issue that we're having in the region, apart from obviously us losing a lot of these species and habitat loss, is actually data deficiency. There is not a lot of numbers that we have in hand for us to be able to actually calculate, unfortunately, exactly how much of their contribution is there. However, looking at things from the wider or global perspective, it obviously is showing us that they are contributing and are key in being able to mitigate climate, the climate impacts. So when we move into the Mediterranean, a lot of people forget to think about the mesopelagic fishes, because fish, for example, in the deep waters, and I'm talking over 500 meters, 1,000 meters deep, these mesopelagic fish communities in the Mediterranean Sea, they play a very significant ecological role. And although we don't have enough data, and we are classified in terms of the Mediterranean Sea as data poor, in this, but these fish are very, very important because of their vertical migration, which is where they help in, again, the cycling of nutrients and also carbon within the waters to bring it all down to the deep sea and storing it down there. So moving into just giving a bit of an example of what it was like, because as a marine biologist and looking at ecosystems and how these ecosystems actually help us in terms of climate mitigation, especially that, say, for example, if we look at the Gulf to be more specific, currently there's a lot of mangrove restoration programs that have been, and initiatives that have been launched in the past 5 years. And it's a very positive thing that we are looking at mangrove restoration. This is very evident when we start looking into some of the research that's been published very recently. Especially, there was a paper that came out just a couple of weeks ago that looked at age, or mapping the age of mangroves in the Gulf. Now, we know for a fact that mangrove systems, seagrass bed systems are great carbon sinks. However, how much carbon is actually being sequestrated in this. And I know for a fact that I've had conversations with a couple of different people within policymaking, and this is a number that everybody would like to get to so that they can get grips as to what their ecosystems are doing and how they can plan for the future as part of many national targets, including, for example, Bahrain, where there is a national target to be carbon neutral by 2060. Now, there was a paper that was published not recently, in 2015, that just it's a case study, and it was on a very small section in the western side of the Gulf, based purely in Saudi Arabia. And it was looking at the carbon burial rates in seagrass beds versus in the mangroves and salt marshes. And it was really interesting because when I was looking at the numbers, as you can see here, for the seagrass beds in the areas that were chosen in Saudi Arabia on the Gulf side, the sea beds or the carbon burial rate in the seagrass beds was recorded as 9 grams of organic carbon per meter per square. Meter square per year. And when we look at the mangroves, it was around 19 grams, and the salt marshes was around 8 grams of organic carbon per meter square per year. What's really interesting is this is very much on the lower side, because if we really were thinking about, okay, you might be questioning what is usually the average. Now, the average that is recorded based on worldwide studies is that seagrass beds basically have a rate of 83 grams, we would say, of carbon, organic carbon that is sequestered. And then we've got mangroves that is between 150 to 250, and salt marshes is 50 to 200. So you can see here that we're very much on the lower scale. So I decided to dig a bit deeper. Digging a bit deeper, what I realized is that the paper further looked at what was the decrease between carbon stocks that were in mature and more established mangrove stands, and then those that have been recently planted. And actually, they seemed like there was a 38% decrease, therefore showing that almost all of these sites that were actually studied was in some way or other heavily impacted by human activity, which has basically degraded their ability to sequestrate carbon. So looking at the paper that was just published in the recent weeks that I mentioned earlier, and that is by Mohan et al. 2023, and they basically created a map that showed the age of mangroves in the Gulf. And what the results showed really went really well and explained a lot of these low numbers that we're seeing. The results of the paper showed that 41.3% of the mangroves in the entire Gulf is actually younger than 5 years. So that means that we're looking at approximately 41% of the mangroves that we currently have in the Gulf is based on restoration efforts by these countries, which is a great thing. But it also shows that we've lost a lot of our older, more established mangroves, thereby taking away the possibility of what they could have been, sequestering in terms of carbon. So this is not a negative thing. It's actually a positive thing, because it is showing us that the more we work on restoring and the more we work on making sure that the keystone species are able to come back into these ecosystems, then naturally these numbers will go up. And this is a definite way towards, like what both Professor Oswald and Mark were saying earlier, that investment in nature is one of the most significant ways to actually mitigate climate change. Now, obviously, I'm not going to bore you with the threats, because I think everybody present here is very much aware of the threats that are faced by these marine ecosystems and the role that they have in the carbon, from overfishing. So we were talking about sharks and how they take in the carbon into their bodies, and when they die off, when it's their time, they go back down to the bottom of the sea, and that's how the carbon gets buried. But when we fish them and we bring them out into the air, obviously then the carbon escapes and adding more into the emissions that are released. And we've got obviously the issues of degradation of habitats because of plastic pollution, coastal development, and much more. Now, it's very important to look at the solutions and how we can enhance marine biodiversity and carbon capture in the region. And it is important to also give credit where it's due. And it's very obvious that there are countries that are working on many initiatives that aim to be able to restore some ecosystems. However, maybe we need to take it a step further and look at the keystone species. And like I said earlier, it's not only about the system, it's about everything within the system. So it's not about the skeleton just, it's also about the organs that are held together. So yeah, so I just wanted to shed some light on some of that. So obviously we know about like coral restoration projects happening in the reef, in the Red Sea, and they're very new, just less than 5 years. And we're still trying to look at what you know, the future might look like. If these are all successful, they need monitoring, we need data to be able to validate things. We have mangrove restoration projects that are very big and large across the Arabian Gulf. We've got systems that are put together in the Mediterranean, looking at MPAs and also gauging how well they're doing, and promoting things from sustainable fishing. And I believe like a lot of these countries have put in various policies, including, for example, the bans on trawling in countries such as Bahrain, the UAE, and others across the country. So I just wanted to end with two things. One was, is that actually the global impacts of local actions in the MENA region is very meaningful and very, very important, because the MENA region is a very big chunk of the world if we really think about it. And being able to actually restore our ecosystems and be able to enable rewilding, bringing back the species that we are losing or where population declines are being witnessed, is very important to enhance carbon storage in the habitats that we're trying to restore. In addition to that, healthy biodiverse ecosystems are seen to be more resilient to climate stresses such as temperature fluctuation and ocean acidification. And of course, once you have a healthy ecosystem, then naturally the communities that live in there will be better able to withstand, adapt to these changes. And biodiversity plays a very key role in maintaining the balance, whereby like species such as, for example, sharks and other predators help regulate prey populations and make sure that the species that are ill or could spread disease are taken out from the ecosystem, thereby enhancing different biological processes such as the carbon pump, thereby facilitating long-term carbon storage. And lastly, of course, the MENA region's oceans are part of a larger oceanic current that influences global climate patterns. So your take-home points for today are basically the importance of the role of biodiversity in carbon sequestration. Please remember that our region is home to many unique biodiverse ecosystems and species which are integral for the marine food web and carbon cycling. We shouldn't be forgetting about the mesopelagic fish that are in deeper waters. They continue to remain data deficient, and it's something we definitely need to look into. And lastly, we definitely need urgent conservation actions that incorporate bringing back key species into these ecosystems. Thank you very much for all of your time and efforts, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Tareen, for your presentation. Very enlightening one, please. And I would just want just to mention for the audience, if they have any question coming from presentations that we presented so far, or the one that will come from Simon, please do put them on the question answer function at the bottom of the screen, please. And hence, I will leave now invite Simon to start his presentation about the policy. Simon is the Chief Advisor for Climate Change for IFO. as he said earlier, and I'm no further ado, just Simon, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Nabe, Dr. Nabe. It's a pleasure to be here again, and I will take you quickly through a presentation on IFAW's recent research onto what can policymakers do, especially in the next year, to get wildlife into their climate action plans with a focus on how to integrate wildlife and wildlife conservation into nationally determined contributions. So what we're really thinking about is how practically can governments across the world, and particularly in the Middle East and North Africa, leverage these scientific findings to maximize carbon sequestration, climate mitigation, and climate adaptation and resilience in their landscapes and communities through their nationally determined contributions. So, as we know, I think most of you are probably working on this already, is that in 2025, each country at COP30 in Belém in Brazil will be required to submit their updated nationally determined contributions, or the NDC 3.0, as the UNFCCC is referring to it. This is seen, as the picture shows, as a crucial leap forward for climate action, in which we are hoping that all countries will greatly increase their ambitions for climate mitigation and also for adaptation. The NDCs must outline each country's plans to take action on climate change. And our belief is that this updating of the NDCs provides a perfect opportunity for countries in the Middle East and North Africa to include the contribution of wild animals and wildlife conservation for mitigation and adaptation purposes. And why should countries include wild animals in their NDCs? Well, we have already heard wonderful presentations on the incredible impact that animals both on land and at sea can make for climate action. But just as a reminder, for mitigation, we know now that healthy wildlife populations help ecosystems store more carbon, so accelerating greenhouse gas mitigation in the land use sector and in seascapes. But also balanced ecosystems provide critical ecosystem services for people and nature, which are critical for climate resilient development and disaster risk reduction. But also wild animals face significant risks from climate change itself. So through climate change mitigation, we can reduce the impact of climate change on wild animals and their habitats and ecosystems more broadly, thereby increasing the resilience of our land and seascapes. In terms of resilience and adaptation, biodiverse ecosystems strengthen the resilience of landscapes and the delivery of ecosystem services that people and animals depend upon. And by building climate resilient landscapes, we can support animals to deliver the benefits that they provide to carbon sequestration and ecosystem health, and thereby enable people and economies to be more resilient to climate change over the long term. Wildlife economies are also incredibly important drivers of economic growth in many countries that are biodiverse and which often, say for instance in Africa, have fewer opportunities at the moment for economic growth. So these economic benefits that come through managing wildlife populations and their habitats provide an economic boost that can be used to support climate resilient development and adaptation at local and national levels. So by protecting and expanding wild animal populations, countries can increase the economic benefits of their citizens. Increasing economic security can in turn support broader resilience for households and communities. But the reality is that as of now, wildlife are missing from NDCs. This is perhaps not surprising, as we're only really recently understanding the contribution that wild animal populations make to the carbon cycle. But you can see here some data that IFOR has gathered on the number of countries with NDC commitments that relate to wildlife conservation, ecosystem protection, and landscape restoration across the least developed countries and other countries in Africa. This includes North Africa, by the way. And so while we know that many countries have included nature-based solutions, broadly speaking, in their NDCs in recent years, wild animals and wildlife conservation are not represented very well. According to our analysis, 60% of African countries and other least developed countries have not included wildlife conservation at all in their climate action plans. So we're seeing here a very significant gap and a missed opportunity to link biodiversity conservation with climate action, and to find ways of leveraging within national climate action plans the incredible power and potential of wildlife conservation and ecosystem protection. So what can countries do? Well, firstly, countries must acknowledge the importance of wildlife conservation and rewilding for accelerating carbon sequestration and supporting adaptation and resilience. A first step then would be to estimate the contribution that wildlife conservation and rewilding can make to mitigation and adaptation in each country, and that can be through modeling existing wildlife populations, understanding their contribution to carbon sequestration, and then looking at the potential over time through the use of statistical modeling, such as that which has been outlined by Professor Schmitz, to see where we can get to through rewilding and wildlife protection and conservation programs. Trophic rewilding, wildlife conservation, and the wildlife economy can be included in national determined contributions as core pillars for delivering climate goals. But we also then need to, importantly, mobilize the money to implement the programs that can accelerate climate action through the wildlife economy and through trophic rewilding. So we need to cost the wildlife-related climate actions to help raise climate finance for the wildlife sector. At the moment, there is minimal attention being paid in climate finance to the potential of wildlife populations for climate mitigation and adaptation. But there's an immense potential to raise finance for those kinds of programs if we can work with the national and the national government departments that are responsible for developing those climate finance plans, and with climate finance providers to link up innovation with investment. We could also use wildlife conservation to raise carbon finance by linking trophic rewilding into carbon finance initiatives. So again, another channel of finance that we can potentially mobilize, as my friend Mark Haller was mentioning earlier in the presentation. At IFOR, we have developed 10 guidelines for countries to follow. These are a set of recommendations, a set of steps, if you will, that those responsible within national governments can use to integrate wildlife and wildlife conservation into their nationally determined contributions between now and the end of 2025. I will run you through them quickly, but these guidelines will be available in a report within the next month, and I'll be happy to share that with you once it's published. But if we start with the first, again, this is really, we need to, as Reem was highlighting, get a grip of the numbers on what the contribution of key wildlife species and wildlife habitats can make to climate change mitigation and adaptation in each country. So within the national territory of each country, on land and at sea. This is a table from some of Professor Schmitz's work that outlines some of the numbers behind key species and their contribution potentially to the additional ecosystem uptake of CO2. So each country can develop an estimate by identifying the species and habitats that may make a contribution, and then looking at what the numbers are to put into the nationally determined contributions. It's also important to identify the major risks that threaten wildlife populations and ecosystems which contribute to climate mitigation and adaptation, so that we can develop effective plans to reduce those risks as a means of protecting and increasing our carbon stocks. So look, we need to begin looking at threat mitigation or risk mitigation for wildlife, not simply as being beneficial in its own terms, in terms of protecting biodiversity, but also in terms of the benefits that can be derived from securing and increasing carbon stocks. Thirdly, each country should specify the key wildlife species and ecosystems that it wishes to protect and restore as part of its NDC commitments. This can be done in line with the national biodiversity action plans and strategies under the conventional biological diversity, so the CBD, but should be integrated also into the NDCs so that we can clearly capture the carbon benefits and adaptation benefits of wildlife conservation and rewilding. Each country can then describe in its NDC the plans that they have to capture the wildlife-nature interactions in their national greenhouse gas inventories. This is really critical because the contribution of wildlife both to, and let's say, wildlife depletion or the degradation of wild habitats is rarely captured very clearly in greenhouse gas inventories. So bringing wildlife into those inventories and into the mitigation hierarchy can be very powerful in terms of providing clarity as to the amount of carbon dioxide emissions that can be avoided and the carbon sinks that can be increased over time in the climate action plans. Fifth, countries can set high-level targets for the delivery of climate change mitigation and adaptation through conservation and restoration of wildlife populations and biodiverse ecosystems, so that they can see by 2030 and by 2050 where they aim to get to. We can then list the actions that each country will take to deliver those wildlife and climate targets. And in the image there, you can see a range of different habitats and types of activity that can be implemented in order to do this. Importantly, each of those actions needs to have a quantum of finance attached to it and a cost-benefit analysis so that we can clearly see what financial support is required to implement those NDC actions that link climate action and wildlife conservation. And aligned to that, it's necessary for each country to outline the capacity, support, and technology transfer that might be required to implement the NDC actions that link climate change and wildlife conservation. A critical part of this, as this image indicates, is how can we adequately and effectively measure and monitor the increase in wildlife populations and their contributions to carbon stocks, and then equally the contributions that wildlife conservation and rewilding can make to local economies and to adaptation and resilience. So an investment into those technical scientific skills to be able to plan, implement, monitor, and report on this climate wildlife conservation nexus is going to be very important. Again, because we currently have a situation in which in most governments and globally, there is a lack of alignment, say, between biodiversity conservation and climate change action across the conventions of the Convention on Biological Diversity and the Climate Change Convention. It will be very valuable to include in your NDC a description of how your country will align the institutional arrangements for managing the country's response to climate change and biodiversity loss in a holistic way that builds up synergies between departments and actions so that biodiversity conservation and climate change are working hand in hand. And equally to identify the policy linkages between your NDC and then other domestic and international policy frameworks to protect wildlife and biodiversity. And by doing so, from the national to the global level, we can start to increase the synergy and to increase the mutual benefits that come from managing biodiversity in a manner that is climate smart and that delivers on these mitigation and adaptation outcomes. So this is just a snapshot of what we have included in our wildlife guidelines for nationally determined contributions. This will be published later in October 24, prior to COP16. I have an embargoed draft available for information, and if you would be interested in reading that, then I'd be very happy to share it with you. And please let my colleagues know if you would like to have the final version when it's released. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Simon, for the very enlightening presentation and taking all this vision about the policy for climate change. And after these 4 or 5 magnificent presentation and enlightening talks, we are very delighted just to have some kind of questions, if you don't mind, that some of the attendees have put on the question answer chat. And one of them is by Fatima Al-Zahra Hassouni, which I would say it's how can we increase the resilience ecosystem in our area, and what are the urgent measures to take? If also Mark can take this question, please. So it's how can we increase the resilience of ecosystems in our area, and what are the urgent measures to take?
Should I take a start at that? You know, anybody who works in the biological sciences knows that diversity is resilience, and that if your ecosystems are healthy, it is because they are diverse, and if they are diverse and healthy, it is likely to increase resilience. And so with the stresses that are placed on our world by development, by misuse of natural resources, resilience becomes an essential factor, because it's the capacity and the flexibility to address the unknown. And so if you don't know at all what to do, a strategy that builds or maintains resilience in your biological systems would be a very safe bet to pursue. So without a deep level of science, knowing that the capacity of your ecosystems to withstand stress, withstand change, to bounce back, is pretty well your best sort of life insurance. It's your best guarantee. And so I think that there's a great deal of interest today in how we can maintain resilience, and it's obviously resilience to climate change very much included. And the way to do that is to ensure a full range of diverse ecosystems, that their essential characteristics are protected, that they are in a network of areas that can feed on one another and therefore exchange biodiversity and build further resilience. But that the concept of resilience, I think, is now one that everybody accepts. Things that are resilient are more flexible. They are less brittle. They're less likely to snap and break. So it's more giving yourself, putting all the chances on your side, while I hope our global community acts at the level necessary. And I think the interesting thing today is that we have, for lack of knowledge or lack of experience, undervalued the role that animals in ecosystems have in building that resilience. And that with the models such as the one that Professor Schmitz illustrated, we're now actually showing that animals are an important factor in ensuring that resilience and in building back that resilience. So I think that this is really promising, because we, those of us who are principally focused on biodiversity conservation, like the result that means that you pay greater attention to animals and ensure their healthy participation in ecosystems. But for those whose principal interest is climate change, the surprising role of animals in ensuring successful climate change action is something that's new to us. It's new to all of us and very encouraging. So I would say that what the consequence of that is that it should be given considerably greater political priority, policy priority in the way that Simon Addison has spelled out, using existing mechanisms like the nationally determined contributions and the NBSAPs in the biodiversity area, ensuring that our governments give that adequate attention as well. So that would be my quick answer to that very good question.
Thank you, Mark, for this enlightening one. I just want to move to the next question if there is no more comment on that point. The next one from Rula Jabbour, and she asking about, can you please tell us more about nature-based accounting and how we can achieve it? So I believe it is possible to maybe Prof. Oswald.
What you have to do in terms of nature-based accounting is calculate how much carbon is being taken up in the system. So you have to really look at things holistically, and then either through measurements of the carbon in different stocks in the plants, in the soils or sediments, you can come up with numbers of how much carbon is being taken up in ecosystems. I presented some data on that. Reem has also shown, the tremendous value that even restoration efforts can make and are starting to make. So we have the scientific ability to do it. It's just part of monitoring and estimating. But when we monitor, we tend to monitor just the presence of species. What we actually have to do is think about their functional roles. And when we start thinking about their functional roles, we then start accounting for how much that function actually contributes. So it's a different way of monitoring, but it's actually just really doing financial accounting. Just remember, a carbon cycle is also a carbon budget. So you can think of that like an accounting that with your bank account, you have inputs, you have savings, and you have outputs. And if you think about it that way, doing financial accounting and carbon accounting are very similar in principle.
Absolutely, yes. This is a very good example just to sum it up, as this is just take it very good point. And the next question is from Fadil bin Radi, and he asked that how we as individuals or organizations or institutions can we contribute practically to tackle this issue. So if I would leave either Mark or Reem, Oz.
Let me start, and maybe Reem can add to it.
Please.
I think we need clear and binding targets. We've gone through decades now with the UNFCCC and the UNCBD making promises and not fulfilling them. And so I think what we need to get to is a world where net zero economic activity from a carbon point of view and nature positive activity become an obligation of doing business that bind on financial actors, that bind on corporations, so that just like today, we would not accept a corporation that employs slave labor, to use an extreme example. We need to get to the point where we should not give credit to a corporation that destroys biodiversity or the climate in the course of making a profit. So I would say that what we need to do is push for standards. I mean, those standards are already accepted, if you like. The Paris Agreement, the UN, the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework set out those targets. What's needed is an accountability framework that increasingly makes them binding. And I think that will happen if there is an increase in public demand for those standards. Reem.
Yeah, thank you, Mark, for that. And definitely building on what Mark was saying, I believe a lot of countries now are working on aligning their national targets and indicators with the global biodiversity framework. And a lot of that, I know there's a big push to incorporate wildlife and ecosystem protection, conservation, and restoration. I think what needs to happen next is that we start integrating wildlife into the targets and as part of the indicators and monitoring systems that are currently being planned out on how to monitor the progress of the targets being set. That is where I think the corporates and different organizations need to be brought in, especially under the umbrella of biodiversity finance or biofin. And I believe there was a comment or a question previously that I saw popped up about resource mobilization, and I 100% agree with you that you know, a lot of it cannot be done without resource mobilization. And actually research is also on a very same scale. Like, it's quite funny because everybody wants numbers, but nobody wants to fund research. And yet people want targets, but nobody wants to fund research, and they want numbers, but nobody wants to fund research. So, and that needs to change, and that mentality needs to change, because research is development. And for us to be able to develop sustainably, we need numbers, and we need to invest in research as part of the monitoring systems. So when we look at people implementing the monitoring, we need to be clear about involving both scientists and researchers into the equation, in addition to actually bringing up citizen science into it, like going out, taking samples, counting, measuring. This can be done, and this is where we can bring together different organizations. And I know that there has been interest in putting up ESG guidelines in the Gulf, for example. And I think those guidelines, as they're being put up, needs to have a robust section that's fully focused on ecosystems and wildlife. And I think this is where we need to push for the standards, because that way we ensure that there is a contribution coming in terms of resource mobilization. There needs to be guidelines on or mandates that mandate everybody to involve research, and at the end of the year come up with data sets, because without having the numbers, we will never be able to assess our progress in the next 5 to 10 years. So yeah, I think yeah, that's it.
Thank you very much, Reem and Mark. The next question, I will direct it to Simon about one question about that the IFO will have some practical or information and clear information about the how wildlife or different wildlife animals are capable of storing carbon. So that means how much each animal species can store from the carbon.
Yeah, that's definitely not a question for me. I think we have to go to Oz for some information on that. But I mean, Oz has been instrumental in developing models and making estimates for the amount of carbon that certain key animal. And maybe, Oz, it's an opportunity to talk about the hotspots analysis that we're planning to do as well.
Yeah. You know, we one of the things that we have to avoid is just making this a panacea that, you know, restoring wildlife everywhere is going to be beneficial. So what we do have to do, as Reem said, we have to do some research, and that research could either be on the ground measurement or through modeling to come up with quantitative estimates of the feasibility of doing some of this work in different locations. And sometimes animals aren't going to be significantly important. In other cases, they're going to be hugely important. And so one of the exercises we're trying to engage in is really looking globally, where are the hotspots on the planet? Where are the places on the planet where we have the highest potential to make a difference, given the land space that's available or the ocean space that's available, to really make a difference. And so it's going to require a lot more work, really, to identify which species and which locations. But then it also, once you know where those locations are, we also have to then work with the local communities really to get them to work with us. And Reem talked about this a little also in terms of citizen science, but it's also about engaging local communities to participate in that and helping them to become stewards of those areas also. So this is all, you know, a way of engaging local communities and not being so top down with it, and getting the buy-in to help, you know, achieve the goals also.
Thank you very much indeed. Just one other question just being typed now against, which is to everyone. It's about if there is any practical or training courses, how to calculate these, how wildlife contribute to absorbing CO2, because it is something new and novice in the system. So if there is any kind of contribution, or can somebody give advice?
So this is something that's in the very early stages. I don't think we've developed any training courses yet on how to do this. It's a good idea to maybe develop something like that as an online mini course or something to that effect. Yeah, that would be something worthwhile to do as a training experience.
Something new, absolutely.
I think it's a good idea. Let me just add that what we're trying to do now, given the promise of the ACC model, is to build up a stronger foundation of case studies. So it's been applied to a number of species in a number of specific locations with promising results. As Oz said, we can't assume that it will always give those results in every circumstance with every animal species or ecosystem. And so what we need to do is to consolidate the foundation that enables us to put forward this model as something that genuinely is part of the solution. And I guess the focus has been particularly on that, but I think that it would be a good idea to facilitate people's understanding of the model and how to make it work and how to apply it in their own particular situations, because that would contribute data that would either disprove or emphasize the promise showed by this approach.
And further, one last question, or not the last question, one of the question that's been directed to Prof. Oswald and to Simon about after these new data about the role of big fauna in carbon sequestration, don't you see that we need to update a lot of tools that work oops, I got the question, just gone 1 minute.
It's moved on to the answered page.
Yeah,
because
sorry. I did notice that
just...
you were typing. Sorry, my mistake. Yeah. So I will. Don't you see that we need to update a lot of tools that work on the footprint for different products in the frame of life cycle assessment and EBD? And thank you, Simon, for your contribution and the question answering.
Yeah, just briefly, I think this is an excellent point and important work that needs to be done. As Professor Schmitz has mentioned, this is really at the stage of generating the foundational evidence of the role that animals play. So I guess a big question for policymakers in this forum and elsewhere is for us to understand what information you require using the tools that are available in order to integrate wild animals more effectively into, say, the mitigation hierarchy, into your greenhouse gas inventories, into these life cycle assessments, etc., and to find ways that we can work together to overcome those hurdles. I would say one thing that IFOR and the GRA have been considering is whether or not an online platform that provides the data that is available and access to models, etc., would be, whether that would be valuable to policymakers. to see, but I think tailoring the data that we have in ways that are useful to you in doing this work, such as you mentioned, would be valuable.
Last but not least, question to Reem. And there is problem about like coral bleach in Bahrain and the Gulf, how it would be contribute to how the replanting or putting the coral again new can contribute in practically in this tackling this issue, please.
Yeah, thank you for that question. Yes, I think coral bleaching is something that's being felt across the world. And obviously we were looking at, I think they said the fifth largest bleaching event worldwide this year. The issue that we're having in Bahrain because of the very extreme environment, and when I say extreme, water temperatures reached 36.8 this year. And so obviously the corals were not very happy. Bleaching has been reported in Bahrain, the UAE, and across the Gulf. I understand that a lot of people have been pushing for coral restoration, and however, based on the experience that we have seen across the Gulf, coral restoration seems to work when we're closer to the Gulf of Oman rather than inside the Gulf. And the main issue is that that the water is much more, depths are much shallower. And also you don't find a lot of the, shall we say, branching coral. And so usually with coral restoration, what happens is that for us to start a nursery, we need frags that are already fallen off onto a reef that are collected. Whereas currently, most of the corals that we have are actually massive corals or submassive. So to start a restoration program, it means we need to go and break them, to frag them. And that will make them more susceptible to disease and actually will harm them more than help them. And so that's why we've been very, very careful not to do that. And instead, we're looking and studying the microbiome to study more about like the resilience that they are showing through their microbial community composition. And we're trying to understand it a bit more and experiment a bit more using that side. And what we usually, this is called assisted evolution, where people are looking at shuffling the microbial communities, looking at possibly giving them antibiotics. It's all in the experimental phase, but actually going down the route of traditional nurseries of using fragments, it's currently not recommended. And that is why we have not been able to successfully implement something large scale. There have been trials in Bahrain, I know, that were led by the Directorate of Fisheries previously in the country, and they've put a lot of effort into it. However, unfortunately, all of the trials failed. So we are working in collaboration with different entities to see how we can assist corals and coral communities to, get back on their feet. However, what we are seeing is in areas where people have claimed that the reefs are dead, that actually the coral is coming back. And it is very interesting. And so we are currently conducting some genetic studies or molecular studies to better understand how this is happening. And it's obviously, like all the presentations have outlined, with the coming back of these coral communities, we are now seeing different species of fish coming back into the area. I know for a fact in areas such as Fesh Al Adlam, for example, it's been 8 years since someone has seen a butterfly fish on the reef. And actually last year we saw our first pair coming back. So obviously something is changing. And I think, the policies that have implemented banning of trawling and other and fishing gear, regulating the kind of fishing gear around that area is starting to have a positive impact. Yeah.
Thank you, Reem, for this very good answer. Last question. Sorry that we have been taken 17 minutes beyond the scheduled time, and this shows that how interesting this topic is and how enlightening and rich the topic is. But promise this is the last question, and if there is any other comment, we'll do it like writing to the guys later on. But one question from Omar, he said that can we contribute in entering data for the emission measuring system and how we can do, and we hope that to get this one like help in facilitating this before the deadline for national contribution. I'm not really sure if I read the question right, if it's clear. So how we can contribute to entering data in the emission measuring software. Pink, Oswald, or Mark, please.
It's a highly technical question. In terms of preparing the NCD report, I think that there's technical assistance available from the Secretariat of UNFCCC in helping countries to prepare their submissions, and that can usually be accessed through the local UNDP office. So if there are difficulties in meeting the requirements of member states, the first port of call, I think, would be the local UNDP office, and through them to the Secretariat of UNFCCC. They do a great deal of assistance to countries in ensuring that their reports are accurate and complete.
I would also suggest that if a country is looking for this kind of support, that it lodges a request for support through the NDC partnership, which is supported by UNDP to provide this technical assistance to countries for this. And through the NDC partnership, they can then reach out to their members to identify the correct people to provide that capacity support. I would say, however, that it's quite likely that there aren't that many people available who have the technical skills to bring the wildlife carbon data into NDCs, and that may be something that we, as a group at Global Rewilding Alliance, need to discuss with the NDC partnership, and to see how we can support them if countries are coming to them with these requests.
Thank you, Mark and Simon, for this one. And by that, I think I'll leave the floor for Akram, just to Dr. Akram, to concluding remark and closing the session. It was a very rich one. Thank you very much, everyone.
أولا لن أطيل الكلمة الختامية نظرا لأننا تجاوزنا الوقت. الشكر لكم على صبركم بزيادة الوقت لمدة 20 دقيقة. لدي شكرين يجب أن أتوجه بهما. أولا للسادة المشاركين من ممثلي الدول العربية المشاركين في هذا الويبينار المفيد جدا. لكم الشكر، ونتشرف وتشرفنا بمشاركتكم، ونتشرف باستمرار التواصل معكم. الشكر الثاني للسادة الخبراء مارك هالي وشميتس وريم، وهناك شكر يعني زيادة شوية على بعض الأمور لزميلنا سايمون من الآيفو. طبعا هنا أوجه الشكر باسم العاملين في مكتب الشرق الأوسط العاملين في الآيفو. شكرا للسيد سايمون. فكرة الويبينار هذا في البداية انطلقت من زميلنا السيد سايمون، وبنفس الوقت تواصل مع الخبراء للإعداد لمثل هذا الويبينار المتميز. أختم كلامي بالشكر لكم جميعا والتمنيات بأن يكون هناك فائدة من هذا الويبينار إن شاء الله، خاصة في رسم السياسات الوطنية في المينا في دول الميدل إيست نورث أفريكا. وإن شاء الله سنرسل لكم كافة المعلومات والريبورت الذي تكلم عنه زميلنا سايمون. سنرسل لكم كافة معلومات مطلوبة، ونتمنى أن نبقى على تواصل. وأختم أيضا الشكر لزملائي الفنيين من أعد تكنيكال ايشوز تتعلق بهذا الويبينار، وزميلي دكتور نابغ والسيد أسامة النوري زميلنا أيضا والذي تولى أمور الترجمة. أكرر شكري لكم جميعا، ونبقى على تواصل إن شاء الله، والشكر لكل من سمعني. السلام عليكم، إلى اللقاء. شكرا جزيلا. Have a nice day. Thank you so much.